The Dinosaur Hour, Sunday the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Tonight we discuss some very disturbing scenes on the streets of London and other big cities last Saturday. Also, we talk about the level of prejudice which appears to have got through into many of our most important institutions. It seems being anti-Israel is almost trendy. We'll go to Tel Aviv to get the latest ahead of the anticipated push by Israeli troops into Gaza. And we'll also talk about net migration figures, an estimate suggesting that up until 2030, they will still run above pre-Brexit levels. Well, all of that in just a moment, but first, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you and good evening. Well, the top story from the GB newsroom is that today the Prime Minister confirmed at least 6 British citizens were killed in Hamas's attack on Israel and a further 10 are still missing. Rishi Sunak visited a Jewish secondary school as well in North London this morning, reassuring the students there his government will always support them. He told the House of Commons in the afternoon the government is going to be providing an extra £10 million in humanitarian aid for Gaza, saying the Palestinian people are victims of Hamas too. Well, in a shuttle round of diplomacy, the US Secretary of State is in Israel once again, holding talks with senior leaders there on how to get aid into Gaza. Antony Blinken's visit comes as doctors in the city say they're struggling to treat huge numbers of patients injured by airstrikes. Aid agencies say hospitals are running out of medicines and fuel for generators, with only the most serious cases given access to vital treatment. And as the two leaders shook hands on the world stage, the United Nations was warning the humanitarian situation in Gaza is deteriorating quickly. Well, there was hope twice earlier today that aid could come in through Egypt's Rafah crossing in the south on its border with Gaza. Calls were being made for the safe passage of humanitarian aid, along with the evacuation of foreign and dual national passport holders from the area. There was an expectation the crossing would open first thing this morning and then again this afternoon, but it still hasn't opened up, despite thousands massing at the border, desperate to get out of Gaza. Meanwhile, in the north, Hezbollah has been firing rockets at Israel, and the Israeli Defence Force has responded with helicopter gunfire as they also continue to gather near Ashkelon in the south to prepare for their ground offensive. The US President Joe Biden telling Iran not to get involved today, and also saying he was confident Israel would act under the rules of war, acting and saying there must be a path to a Palestinian state. Well, in news away from Israel, the Foreign Secretary is in Albania to help tackle illegal migration. James Cleverly is attending the annual Berlin Process Summit in Tirana, along with Western Balkan and European leaders. He's been seeking cooperation on the movement of migrants as the government works to stop small boats crossing the English Channel. And lastly, a Conservative MP accused of bullying and sexual misconduct is facing suspension. A parliamentary panel found that Peter Bone committed varied acts of bullying and one act of sexual misconduct. The panel's recommending he be suspended for 6 weeks, a move that could trigger another possible by-election. The member for Wellingborough denies the allegations. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
Well, on Saturday, there was the much anticipated march in London, and the scale of it, I think, surprised many, many people. Estimates of about 30,000 people in the streets of London, marching all the way down to Parliament, and it was noisy, it was vociferous, and I have to say much of it, it seems, was a fine line between standing up for a free Palestine and incitement of real hatred against the state of Israel and therefore the people that live in it. From the river to the sea, Palestine should be free is a chant that basically says Israel as a country should be obliterated. Not that I'm suggesting it was an easy job for the police, but it wasn't just here. Manchester also had another very similar protest, as indeed did Belfast, and you can see the Irish tricolours there. And Edinburgh as well had a protest. Interestingly, the parents of the Scottish First Minister were in that crowd in Edinburgh. The nature of some of this was deeply unpleasant. You can see here scenes of marchers in the London street. And they're busy chanting, and we've actually muffled the noise because some of the language that is being used isn't very pleasant. And then they see a man with an Israeli flag. Now, you may say that was something of an act of provocation, but absolutely his right to do so. And you see the police basically shielding him for his own protection. So some of this was very, very unpleasant. Other things that were seen on that march were clearly outright glorification of the terrorist murders, the 1,200 terrorist murders that took place in Israel. See these two women. They've sellotaped to the back of their jackets pictures of a paraglider. Parachutes, paragliders, as you know, this was what was used for that festival, those young people at that music festival, over 200 of whom were killed. Later on in the evening, it seemed a celebration with a big crowd in Trafalgar Square, fireworks being set off into the sky, and indeed statues of former monarchs of this country being defaced. One of the things I find just so incredibly confusing is how the progressive left and some of the youth seem to be supporting this Palestinian cause. Here we have an extraordinary sign saying Queers for Palestine. Now, I don't quite know when that picture was taken, whether it was Saturday, whether it was before, but perhaps these people saying Queers for Palestine ought to understand that in Gaza, homosexuality between men is illegal, punishable by 10 years in prison, and many accounts that Hamas actually torture those they believe to be homosexual. But this shows the absolute mess that the so-called progressive left have got into. Many on the left appear to be supporting an ideology that is not very far away from that emerged in Germany in the early 1930s. And I really, genuinely believe that. And perhaps no surprise that the star speaker on Saturday was, of course, one Jeremy Corbyn. And the last image I'm going to show you from Saturday is the most disgraceful one. Yes, that is the cenotaph. And right next to it is a stage that's been put up with slogans about Palestine. Quite how the local council or the police, and they're now blaming each other, could have allowed that to be put up next to a cenotaph, I simply don't know. It all really makes me ask the question, is this now modern Britain? Are those scenes reflective now of really quite a large part of our population? Let me know what you think. Farage@gbnews.com. I rather fear that it is. Let's go straight to Tel Aviv to be joined by GB News' Charlie Peters. Charlie, I know we're waiting, anticipating this big military push into Gaza, but from what I can see, activity on Israel's northern border with Lebanon has become increasingly tense.
Yes, Nigel, and before we get to that, I just want to pick up on what you've been discussing on the situation in London, because we have been stunned here, the GB News team in Israel, the number of British Israelis we've spoken to, and we've spoken to a dozen, who have said that they feel safer in Tel Aviv than they would do in London right now, even under constant rocket attacks from Hamas. We were in a shelter just an hour ago. Even in this war zone, many of them have been extremely shocked by the situation back home. As I said, we've spoken to dozens of British Israelis here, and indeed some people who've recently come from London and Jewish people who live in Israel, absolutely appalled by those scenes, the glorification of Hamas. But they are also focusing on that existential threat to themselves in their home country here, especially in the north, that recent escalation between the border with Lebanon, with Lebanese Hezbollah launching rockets and anti-tank guided missiles into IDF military outposts over the last 24 hours. Most of the coastline we've seen here in Tel Aviv, we've been seeing fighter jets heading south and Apache helicopters heading south towards the Gaza Strip. But in the last night or so, there has been a shift in the direction. More and more military assets appear to be heading north to target those Hezbollah targets. And it comes in the last 2 hours as Benjamin Netanyahu said that he warned Iran not to test us. He said that they have been pushing this proxy war ever closer towards a serious escalation. And he confirmed that Israel was preparing for a long war on several fronts. He very much issued that warning strongly at the same time as a spokesman for the IDF said that a potential visit from Joe Biden, the US president, at this time would be of strategic importance, rallying around Israel and showing and demonstrating to regional powers that Israel is not here to be messed with. There are, of course, significant US military assets in the Eastern Mediterranean, more of them in Cyprus as well, gathering on that floating base for NATO power, looking very carefully at the situation here. Spy planes are buzzing up and down this coastline, keeping an eye on the Gaza Strip, but more and more, no doubt, they will be observing the movement in Lebanon and also in Syria, where the Israeli Air Force has launched strikes on international airports there, issuing very kinetic and stern warnings towards those Iranian proxies in the region. Do not test us.
Yeah, well, a war on several fronts, the ultimate nightmare for Netanyahu. And I must ask, there's an estimated 199 people who've been taken hostage by Hamas. We've heard very little about them or their fate. It was interesting to note that Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas was saying overnight they should be released. So clearly, it's Hamas that are totally in charge. What do we know of these 200 people?
Very little. And yesterday, the Prime Minister here did meet with families of those hostages for the first time. Scenes that did look extremely tense. Some of those faces of those relatives, not just pained, but angry. How did this happen? The unthinkable that their loved ones would be pulled into terrorist territory, almost certainly being kept in that labyrinth of shelters and tunnels that Hamas maintain underneath the surface in Gaza, some 500 kilometres. And they know that it will be an extremely difficult task to extract them. But the government has said this afternoon that they will be relentless in their efforts to try and retrieve those hostages, which are being used as bargaining chips by Iran to try and prevent this conflict from escalating further. They said that they will release the hostages. Iran said that they will be supporting the release of the hostages if the siege lifts. Well, on the Israeli side, they say that they will lift the siege once the hostages are released and when Hamas lay down their weapons and surrender. That's clearly not going to happen.
No, I agree. Charlie Peters from Tel Aviv, thank you once again. What a fascinating comment from Charlie there, saying that actually British people are feeling safer in Tel Aviv than they would be on the streets of London, which is an horrendous thought. But one person who's decided to get involved is Mariah Mensah. Now, Mariah was born in northwest London, moved to Israel, and was back in the UK when all of this commenced. She's gone back to Israel and, as I understand it, volunteered for the Israeli Defence Force, and she joins me live down the line now. Mariah, 21 years old, and you're signing up for the army. What is your motivation? What do you think you could achieve?
Well, I mean, for me, it's just the fact that there's so many people in our country right now that are completely devastated. There are families that have been torn apart. My own friends, I have a friend who's been kidnapped. I have two friends who have been murdered in their homes. I mean, that for me is enough. And I feel strongly that I want to come and I want to join and I would like to defend my country. We need to stop this from happening again. This cannot happen again. Israel cannot take another attack, another atrocious attack like the one that was carried out last Saturday.
And Mariah, you are prepared to risk life and limb to do this, to stand up for what you believe to be so wrong, which I agree with you totally was, and to defend the state of Israel. You are prepared to put your life on the line to do this. So
I obviously won't be going into Gaza. Don't send girls into women into other enemy countries, but I am prepared to help, and I'm prepared to be with the country of Israel and defend the borders in any way we can. Like I said, to stop any more terrorists from coming in. A lot of terrorists have tried to re-enter and continue what Hamas started on Saturday. We will not let that happen again.
No, well, you'll be there trying to stop that happening. And just tell me, you know, we heard a moment ago from Charlie Peters that we had, you know, British people currently in Tel Aviv saying they feel safer in Tel Aviv than London, and some shocking scenes on the streets of London and elsewhere last Saturday. How would you assess the mood in Israel right now amongst ordinary folk?
Well, it's a bit chaotic. I mean, I think the country's been completely, everyone's in complete distress. People, you know, there's no day-to-day activities happening. People have not gone back to the day-to-day life. A lot of, not even people that have been directly affected, but the whole country has been completely stopped in their tracks. Well, a lot of people have been, like we can see, helping out any way possible. A lot of volunteers. It's quite beautiful to see, actually. Israel's very compassionate. People have been spending all their time since Saturday trying to raise money for soldiers, trying to bring food to soldiers, to families that have been evacuated from their house from the south. People have been giving up their homes to host other families. We've all come together. It's quite a miraculous sight. This is one of the reasons why I love my country so much, because we are one and we are united. And, you know, even not in the military aspect, we will fight together as people, to be together, and we will lift each other up. And it's been beautiful to see and beautiful to watch under the circumstances.
Well, I have to say, 21-year-old Mariah Mensah, they are strong and they'll be inspiring words for many people. And thank you for joining us live down the line from Israel and explaining why you're doing what you're doing, defending Israel. Thank you. Well, that was very, very interesting. You see, there are people out there around the world that actually believe in their country. And there are many of us that believe in our country. It's just that it seems there's a growing number of people in this country who have a different set of priorities. In a moment, we'll talk about the BBC protest. It's going on right now, a Jewish protest outside the BBC, quite well attended, and goodness me, when I tell you what's been happening on BBC's Arabic service, you will realise these people have much to protest about. Back with you in a couple of minutes.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie, second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Earlier on today, we sent GB News' Joe Casper down to Broadcasting House to ask BBC staff as they entered the building, is Hamas a terrorist organisation?
GB News, hi. Do you think Hamas are a terrorist organisation? Do you think the BBC should call them terrorists?
I'd love to get into work where I'm already late.
Thank you.
I've got to go and get my lunch.
GB News, do you think Hamas are a terrorist organisation? Do you think that the BBC should call Hamas terrorists? GB News, do you think that Hamas are a terrorist organisation? Do you think that the BBC should name them a terrorist organisation? Do you think they're wrong to go against the government? They're a prescribed organisation? That's not good enough for the BBC.
Well, we put out a form of words, as you know, that is that Western governments, including the UK, have prescribed Hamas as a terror organisation. We say that every single bulletin. And also all the other broadcasters, Sky, Channel 4 News, ITV News, they have the same position. It's not just the BBC. Okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. GB News, do you think that Hamas are a terrorist organisation?
Not getting involved.
GB News, do you think Hamas are a terrorist organisation? Do you think the BBC should call them terrorists? Do you think the BBC should call them terrorists?
Well, not much change out of the BBC, unsurprisingly. Well, right at the moment, the National Jewish Assembly have organised a protest right outside Broadcasting House. And I'm joined by GB News national reporter Theo Chikomba. Theo, what are the scenes down there right now?
Good evening. Well, it's fair to say there are several hundred people who have come for this protest, or you can call it a rally as well. We may be able to show you some of those pictures now. Lots of them started arriving just after 5 p.m. and we've heard from several speakers during that time. But as you pointed out, that there has been this issue about the language which has been used by the BBC when referring to Hamas. They've stayed away from calling them a terrorist group, but instead have said militants, which some people said is not the right way, particularly when BBC broadcast to many people across the country and indeed the world. And information and the right words to use is something that those who are here are saying it needs a change, essentially. But we are kindly joined by Lawrence this evening, who was in Israel not that long ago. Lawrence, thank you so much for your time this evening. So just tell me about your trip and sort of what you've made of what's happened in the last few days.
We went to Israel to be with our family, and last Saturday morning we were woken up with a siren about 7:30, ran to the safe room. We didn't really know that much about what was happening, and then around the middle of the day we discovered what was happening. It was a Sabbath, it was a festival, a celebration. The mood in synagogue changed in 1 minute, from one of partying to one of saying prayers and psalms. It was unbelievable. In 1 minute the whole atmosphere changed. The news slowly came through about this genocidal army, a terror army coming through. At first it was 300 dead, 400 dead, 500 dead. I think now it's about 1,300 dead. The first day in Tel Aviv we had 5, 6 lots of sirens. We had to run for shelter, including at night with our 3 small grandchildren, who 1, 4 and 6, carrying them under our arms, crying. I wanted to know what was happening. We were there until last Friday, until Wednesday. We went through constant thud of Iron Dome intercepting incoming rockets. They're still coming in today as you're there. There's a warning you can have that tells you when rockets are coming in, the constant noise of that, in Tel Aviv, not that many sirens. We were at the airport, meant to go back on a BA flight, which had to turn around. There was a siren, mad panic as everyone goes into shelter. People could have easily, if someone tripped a stampede, people could have been killed. We were abandoned our flight was cancelled 3 times, and we decided to make our own way home. The 2 of us spent 5 hours on the internet searching for flights. Unfortunately, we got 2 flights to Marseille at 1:25 in the morning. We were on that flight at 5:25 in the morning, literally running all the way and through security to get on the plane. Great to be back home, but we still, if there's a loud noise or something, we still feel a little bit of caution and shock. We heard a noise a bit like a siren, and we both looked to each other and thought, what do we do? We've got 2 children left there. Our daughter-in-law is a doctor. She was working 24-hour shifts. She was treating unbelievable injuries, including a 7-year-old hit by a rocket in critical condition, and treating Hamas terrorists. But why I'm here today, you had the most horrific attack by a terror group. The BBC is the world's most important media company. The world looked to the BBC for guidance, for example. This was a terror attack. The BBC have not had problems calling things terror attacks before. Hamas is a prescribed terror organisation by the British government. Their reluctance to use the word militant really understates it. You get a feeling it's the odd militant doing something. It does give totally the wrong impression. It's the way you frame things, the way you say things makes all the difference. There's been lots of issues on BBC reporting, but this is fundamental. If you don't recognise what happened, you'll never recognise the truth, and you must recognise the truth.
Lawrence, thank you so much for your time. Of course, you heard his experience there, his relatives, his families, who he's been with in the last week or so. But when it comes to the issue here, this is what the BBC have said in a statement. We always take our language very seriously. Anyone watching or listening to our coverage will hear the word terrorist used by many, and we attribute it to those who are using it. For example, the UK government. This is an approach that has been used for decades and is in line with other broadcasters. And they also went on to say the BBC is an editorially independent broadcaster whose job it is to explain precisely what is happening on the ground so our audiences can make their own judgment. And it is on that we've heard some senior BBC correspondents say, well, our job is to report rather than giving terms in this case for this story.
No, I know.
And that's an issue that many those who here have an issue with, yeah.
No, Theo, thank you very much indeed. That audience not buying that argument. And you know, you get a Jewish protest and a few hundred people turn up. You get a pro-Palestine march or celebration, whichever it was, and you get 30,000 turn up, which says a lot about how this country is changing. And some of the prejudice out there is extraordinary. Deji Davis, yes, he of the Football Association that absolutely refuses tomorrow night when England play Italy for the Israeli flag to be on the Wembley Arch. He, believe it or not, he's chairman of inclusivity at the FA, yet he was urging people in 2013 not to visit Israel where the under-21 European Championships were being played, and at his own wedding he asked for donations to Palestinian causes. Somebody in charge of inclusion who clearly wants Israel to be excluded. As for the BBC, well, BBC Arabic service, which, by the way, is funded by you, the taxpayer, 6 BBC journalists have been rightly suspended for using expressions on Twitter after those terrible terrorist murders, expressions such as "morning of hope" was how some of them saw what had happened in Israel of that day. Clearly, utterly biased all the way through. And Ofcom, yes, our good friends at Ofcom. Well, Fadzai Madzirira, Ofcom Director of Online Safety, and yes, she said that the UK's support of Israel is a vile colonial alliance, and she has been suspended. Well, joining me to discuss all of this down the line is Rabbi Y.Y. Rubenstein. And Rabbi, the last time we spoke, you just stood down as somebody that was giving content to the BBC. It looks like your accusations of bias against the organisation have proved to be wholly founded.
Very tragically so. It was astonishing in the clip before, you managed to get one BBC person to admit that they sometimes have a problem saying the word terrorist, but they say it. No, they don't. And John Simpson, they put out John Simpson himself on the BBC website, explaining why they will not use the word terrorist when it comes to Hamas or Jews. But they use it for ISIS, they use it for Al Qaeda. Yeah, the BBC's got a problem with Jews.
Yeah, no, it really has. But do you think also we've got a problem in this country? I mean, how is it young progressives, young university students are out marching for a cause that's being fronted by people who, frankly, have an ideology that we saw in the 1930s? What's happened to this country?
Now, that's a very important point. The far left, the circle between the far right and the far left unites when it comes to Jews. And what you're seeing now, I can't remember which UK newspaper talked about this, what happened to the Jews when the Gaza terrorists came across as being a Holocaust. But in the same way as you have Holocaust deniers, who are generally people who are Holocaust applauders in the Nazi camp, you have in the left-wing Nazi camp people who are applauding and then going on to deny it. Listen to the speeches at these rallies, these Palestinian rallies. They're saying that no. And indeed, the Palestinians, the Hamas spokesman, denied any civilians were taken captive, any children were slaughtered, pregnant mothers who were killed and had their fetuses ripped out of their bodies. That never happened, despite the clear evidence from their own videos. So what you're seeing here is the far left coming out as being all the time the far right. Islamo-Nazis, not Islamists. It's Islamo-Nazis now, a whole new thing supported by the far left in British society.
Well, one thing we always know, Rabbi Rubenstein, is when you come on this programme, you always say things that we're going to remember. And that new phrase, which will be loathed by many on the centre-left media, is one that will stay with me. Thank you for joining us again on this show. Right, in a moment, Suella Braverman tells the glorifiers of terrorism the police are coming for you. But are they really? We'll discuss that in just a moment.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, Suella Braverman talking tough, as Tory politicians and particularly Home Secretaries do. Yeah, she's clear. If you're seen to glorify terrorism, the police are coming to get you. Well, are they really? Or is this just normal talk we get from this Conservative government? Well, Chris Phillips is former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. Chris, I am not pretending for one brief moment that what the police had to do on Saturday was easy, because it jolly well wasn't. But those 2 women with sort of, parachutists strapped to their backs, that was clearly the glorification of terrorism.
Yes, it was. I mean, you have to take it back, though, to say policing demonstrations is very difficult. Yeah. The first aim of that is to keep people safe and to prevent a riot. And, of course, police have to pick and choose the moments they do things. They won't always arrest on the day. There's a great deal of work done around evidence finders, evidence gatherers, that then can go and identify these people and arrest them later. So that's a big part of policing these days, policing demonstrations these days.
Right, so you're saying if people were there, and they were coming out with chants that were vile, offensive, and in support of the actions that took place in Israel on that day, that actually the police may well catch up with them.
Yeah, they may well do, and that's often the way that police do these things. Of course, you have to bear in mind that the police may not have seen what was said. They may be viewing videos that we've seen online and not having noticed even the patches on the back of these women. So I think you have to be understanding of the police trying to keep the peace. You know, should we be allowing this sort of thing? Well, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. And of course, well, you're putting the police in a difficult situation.
When you say should we? I mean, people's right to protest, people's right to demonstrate is quite important too.
It's absolutely important, and that's what it's all about. Yeah. But of course, you know, many of the public and many of the people there would have been pro-Palestinian and not necessarily pro-Hamas. But of course, you are going to get that nub of extremists that we saw and that are always shown on the television, because the television will pick up those people. Yeah. And the police often won't necessarily have seen the offences that we're talking about.
You also got an awful lot of rather aggressive young men on the streets of London on Saturday. You can see it from the videos, the chanting, the faces. I guess the police must fear that if they go in heavy, there'll be a full-scale riot.
Yeah, and that's the thing, you know, police officers are peace officers, and they know very well that within a riot, within a big group situation, arresting one or two people can then cause chaos, because the support that comes in for them from other people within the group. So I think the police are sensible to deal with it in a sensitive way as they can. And it won't always be arresting people on the day. But of course, sometimes it needs to be, and that should be done. And if police see these heinous crimes, then they should be arrested at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I just wonder, you know, we've not had in the last few years the terrorist outrages that seem to be mounting up, going back, and you and I have discussed this before, and the extent to which the intelligence services and counter-terrorism have actually been rather effective. But nor has radical militant Islam had a current-day reason, perhaps, to be upset and angry. I mean, I think the Libya war was an example of where actually what we and the French, with American support, did actually helped ISIS to grow in the first place. It was moronic, but that's the past. But at some point, there's going to be heavy fighting in Gaza, you know, whether that's tomorrow or in 3 or 4 days' time, I don't know. Are we worried about an uptick? Given that the position of the British government is quite firmly to support the position of Israel, is this a moment at which intelligence and counter-terrorism goes into overdrive?
I think it is, and I think they have been for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I think there's a real sense that something's going to happen. Of course, there was even an edict put out from Hamas about committing terrorist acts over the weekend, which luckily, I mean, we had something in France, didn't we, that a terrorist attack in France.
Paris.
You know, we only have to have one of these people.
I know.
One of these people go bad, decide to do that, and unfortunately, we've got a big rump of very extreme people in this country, and we've allowed them in, you know, for one reason or another.
Well,
we've allowed them in, and you've done a great deal of work over the years to try to...
200 young men came in this morning across the English Channel. We've no idea where they're from or where their loyalties lie.
And this is the big issue for society, and it's not only the UK either, it's the whole of Europe. And I think you'll find France have got an even bigger issue than we have. But this is a big issue, and it's something that one person committing a terrorist attack is a huge...
The fact that France is worse off doesn't cheer me up particularly. No. Chris Phillips, as ever, thank you for coming on the show. Let's get some good news. Let's go to Australia and be joined by Alexandra Marshall, online editor of The Spectator Australia. And Alexandra, we predicted that the government wanting separate racial rights for Aborigines and other Indigenous peoples of Australia, a separate group, almost like a third chamber in the Parliament. We predicted that common sense Australians would smash it down in the referendum, and so they did.
We've had an excellent weekend here down in the Pacific area. Not only did Australia win their referendum against a racial division inside our constitution, New Zealand also showed the Labor government, the socialists over there, the door. And so we've been celebrating non-stop since then. But in Australia, with our referendum, we had every state and territory vote against the idea of putting this racial victimhood idea into our constitution, except for Canberra, where all the politicians are and all the bureaucrats. They voted for it, but it was just them. The remote and regional communities where the Aboriginal populations are the highest, they voted against it in the highest numbers, showing this was a city issue. It was an issue put forward by the university class, by the activist class, by the white guilt class who were trying to use it to make themselves feel better about the world and everything they've done. And all the regions and remote communities said, no, please don't come here and tell us what to think. We would like you to go away.
Well, do you know what? I think Westminster and Canberra would be very, very similar because Westminster would have voted overwhelmingly for something like this. Just goes to show how out of touch so much of mainstream media and our political and I have to say corporate classes, because Qantas, the national airline, had vote yes all over the aeroplanes, didn't it?
Not just Qantas, we had all the banks, we had the sports stadiums, we had big business. Everywhere you went in the streets, they had the, Truth Treaty T-shirts over all the businesses. And you know what? We were promised by one of the architects of The Voice that if this didn't work, we would never have to hear another welcome to country again. Well, we're going to hold martial lanes to that. We don't want to be welcome to our own country anymore. This should be a watershed for Australia when it comes to race politics. Yeah. And what they're calling for now, they're calling for an audit into the $40-odd billion a year that we spend on Indigenous communities that doesn't get there. Where does the money go? Australia now wants to know where that money is going. The can of worms has opened.
Well, Alexandra...
It has opened.
It's your Brexit moment, and I think another referendum on getting rid of the monarchy is pretty unlikely now under this Prime Minister. And well done you at the Australian Spectator for making the arguments that you have right through this campaign and before. And well done. Thank you. There we are, folks. There's always some good news somewhere. You may have to look sometimes to find it. In a moment, we're going to talk net migration. A prediction put out today with the Migration Observatory that even by 2030, annual net migration will still be higher than it was before Brexit. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I told you the good news wouldn't last long.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Let's take back control of our borders and reduce the number of people coming into our country. That is what people voted for in the Brexit referendum. They voted for it again in the European election of 2019. They voted for it again in the general election in December of 2019. But it's not happened because the legal net migration figure yesterday was an astonishing 600,000. But the Migration Observatory from Oxford are predicting that even by 2030, net migration will still be pushing 300,000 a year more than before the Brexit vote. Well, Dr. Mike Jones is Executive Director of Migration Watch. The 600,000 figure, Mike, was a huge figure, partly because of people coming, refugees from Hong Kong, Ukraine, etc. But we're also told huge numbers of students are coming to the United Kingdom. Some suggestions they shouldn't be included in the net migration figures, because there seems to be an assumption amongst our political class that all these students, once they finish, go home, but they don't really, do they?
No, well, obviously students have to be included in the net migration figures because of population pressures on housing, on infrastructure, on public services. So it's right and proper that they are included in the statistics. In terms of leaving the country, the Migration Observatory, in their forecasts, I believe are being overly optimistic.
Do you?
Because their assumptions are based on 21% of students remaining in the country long term. But Robert Jenrick has cited a figure closer to 40%. So that requires clarification because that puts a spanner in the works in terms of the forecasts.
I mean, being a foreign student, the universities love it because they pay quite a lot of money to come every year. But if up to 40% stay forever, that's a huge number, isn't it?
It is, and there's more to this. The student composition has actually changed radically since we left the European Union. So the number of European students has actually nosedived. The number of non-European students has skyrocketed. There's a large cohort from, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the gap between our economy and their economies is greater than the gap between our economy and other EU states. So the incentive to remain here long term is much, much higher.
And equally, the gap between our culture and their culture is bigger too, isn't it?
Indeed.
So in terms of assimilation, in terms of integration, that makes it a bigger problem, doesn't it, going ahead?
Well, yes, I mean, immigration isn't just about economics.
No.
It's also about culture and social cohesion. Obviously, the economics and the culture do dovetail in certain areas. But ultimately, as we've seen over the past week or so, the impact of migration is intergenerational. And, obviously people import their own values.
Well, yes, I mean, the Palestinian movement is an example of a relatively new population in this country having a different set of priorities to us.
Absolutely, yes. People import their own ethnic loyalties and rivalries, and obviously this can create difficulties in terms of social cohesion.
Oh, and we've seen this playing out on the streets of Birmingham with Hindu groups and Muslim groups clashing. We've seen it over the last couple of years. I mean, if net migration is still 300,000 or more, you think, by 2030, we've just become addicted to cheap foreign labour, haven't we?
Yes, I agree with that. There's a sort of political economy of migration, and you have vested interests within the cabinets, you have business groups, and obviously you have third sector organisations. So there is a pressure there to either maintain the status quo or actually increase the numbers.
No, there is. And a final thought on illegal immigration / asylum. So many strong, bellicose words from successive Home Secretaries. Big court case, we're awaiting a judgment. Any thoughts where we're going?
Well, it's very interesting because the Migration Observatory, they believe the asylum numbers will remain more or less constant, but we have a general election around the corner. So even if the Supreme Court rules in favour of the government, the Rwanda plan is given the green flag. If Labour come into power, they will scrap Rwanda, they will amend and water down the illegal migration plan. And that could actually increase the pull factor. And if you look at the number of people coming across the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus Strait,
significantly
the Balkans, it's up. And the Labour Party wants a returns policy, but they're not going to get that. The EU have completely ruled this out. They will have to have essentially an exchange programme, which could increase illegal migration.
Oh dear, I have a feeling, Mike Jones, you'll be back on the programme. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, my subject access request with NatWest Bank was supposed to come back within a month, but it didn't. They asked for an extra 2 months. The reason was my case was complex. Well, no, not really. Because what is happening is that the report, the so-called independent report by a city legal firm, will come back to NatWest next week. There will be a NatWest board meeting that will take place next week. At it, we're assured that Dame Alison Rose will not be leaving the bank with the full £11 million. That's shares, that's salary, that's bonuses for performance. So there's going to be quite a big cut. And I'm guessing in doing that, they'll hope that it covers up whatever horrors there are about me in their subject access request. But I'm pleased to say that at least one of the high street banks doesn't act with political prejudice, at least not with me, and that is Lloyds Bank, who have offered me both personal and business accounts. And having been turned down, having been rejected by 10 different banks, and I can't even begin to tell you how nice it is for at least one of them to say, we're happy to do your business. But, folks, this isn't the end of the story. Far from it. Because what I've learned since I launched this back in the summer is that there are over 1 million of you who, over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, have had your bank accounts closed. Some personal, some business, some family trusts, all sorts of reasons for this. And yet, many bewildered out there, embarrassed out there, disadvantaged out there. And I am not going to let this rest. We need fundamental change, wholesale change to the entirety of our banking system, because frankly, it is just not working. I'm very pleased that GB News did the Don't Kill Cash campaign. But we've got to get to a situation where everybody in this country is entitled to have a bank account. Because frankly, you can't function in the modern world. You can't pay your bills unless you've got a functioning bank account. There are some challenger banks. There are some fintech solutions out there. Some of them are very, very good, but they can't give you a mortgage and they can't pay interest on the positive balances you've got because they don't have full banking licenses in what is a little bit of a closed shop. The government have talked tough. The FCA have promised to act. There is one hell of a lot more to do. Whether the Labour Party can bring themselves to make this a big issue if they win the election remains to be seen. But this is one I'm never going to stop campaigning on. Enough from me. Let's have a look at the weather.
Evening, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Things pretty calm out there at the moment, but through this week, it's going to turn very wet and very windy with the potential for some significant disruption from this area of low pressure that this morning here at the Met Office, we named Storm Babbitt. It's moving northwards, bringing a lot of moisture, slow-moving bands of heavy rain likely to cause some problems. We have a number of Met Office yellow warnings in place. Out there this evening, though, it's the calm before the storm. A fine night, actually. With clear skies, it'll turn quite cold